My name is Vicki Barnes. I was 28 years old the night my brother pointed his customized champagne flute at me and introduced me to a Texas telecom magnate with a single word: dropout. He added a practiced shrug, letting the word hang in the air as if it explained every flaw in my existence. My mother nodded along from across the mahogany table, offering a soft, enabling chuckle designed for high society photographs. They all waited for the billionaire to laugh at the joke. But here is the structural flaw in their narrative. I did not fail out of college. I walked away because my forensic coding skills were already commanding covert consulting bounties they could never comprehend. And the man they were trying so desperately to impress already knew it. Welcome to Savage Revenge Stories, where we explore the quiet strength it takes to break generational cycles and the moments the truth finally balances the ledger. How old were you when you realized your family would gladly trade your dignity for a seat at the table? Drop your age in the comments and subscribe. Now, let me tell you what happened when the laughing stopped. The rehearsal dinner took place at a country club in Dallas. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the July heat, though the 75 guests seemed too insulated by their wealth to notice. Crystal caught the ambient light, refracting off heavy silverware and the polished centerpieces. I spent the first hour seated at the farthest edge of the arrangement, right near the swinging doors of the kitchen. I did not mind the placement. It gave me a clear vantage point. I sat quietly, tracing the routing inefficiencies of the catering staff and mapping the blind spots of the room ceiling security cameras. It is a reflex born of my profession. I read systems. I find the broken nodes. My brother Preston stood at the center of the room. He smoothed the lapel of a tailored jacket that cost more than my car. He flashed a media-trained smile toward the bride family. Wyatt Kensington sat directly across from him. Wyatt owned a telecommunications empire that mapped half the rural broadband in the state. He did not return Preston's smile. He merely rested his forearms on the table, observing my brother with the detached focus of a predator studying a loud bird. "We are gathered here to celebrate the merging of two great legacies," Preston began. His voice projected the effortless charm that had secured his initial round of venture funding. He gestured toward our parents. My father, Charles, sat rigid. He offered a tight nod while adjusting his gold Rolex. The watch ticked with a constant pressure against his wrist, betraying a suffocating anxiety beneath his suit. My mother, Eleanor, sat beside him, the picture of serene compliance. Preston's eyes swept the room and landed on me, lingering in the shadows of the floral arrangements. The charm in his expression hardened into something brittle. He needed a contrast to elevate his own status in front of the Kensington family. He needed a prop. "And of course we have my sister Vicki," Preston said. He tilted his glass in my direction and delivered his punchline: "The dropout." A low murmur rippled through the dining room. I did not flush. I did not reach for my water glass to hide my face. Instead, my thumb traced the worn edge of my University of Texas class ring. I felt the cold, intrinsic weight of the metal. I kept my posture neutral, my eyes fixed on the billionaire seated across from my brother. Wyatt Kensington did not laugh. The silence stretched, turning the air in the room to ice. Preston's smile began to falter, the edges tightening as the seconds ticked by. Wyatt pushed his heavy oak chair back. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor, a sound that cut right through the country club gentility. He stood up. He did not look at Preston. He did not acknowledge the outstretched champagne flute. Wyatt walked deliberately around the length of the mahogany table, his gaze locked entirely onto mine. The room held its collective breath. My father stopped adjusting his watch. My mother hand fell to her lap. Wyatt stopped directly in front of my chair. He extended a calloused hand. I stood up and met his grip. It was firm, carrying the weight of a man who dealt exclusively in facts. He looked me in the eye, and in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent room, he delivered 8 words. "You are the architect who saved my company." The ambient noise of the country club ceased to exist. 50 seconds ago, the room had been a symphony of clinking silver, polite laughter, and the soft hum of string music drifting from the corner. Now, the silence was so profound, it felt heavy, pressing down on the shoulders of every guest seated along the mahogany table. Wyatt Kensington kept his calloused hand extended. He did not break eye contact with me. I felt the rough texture of his palm against mine. It was a firm, deliberate grip. To my left, a sharp, resonant clatter shattered the quiet. Preston's customized champagne flute slipped from his fingers. The crystal hit the polished wood of the table, tipping sideways. Pale gold liquid spilled across the surface, soaking rapidly into the pristine white Belgian linen tablecloth. Preston did not reach for a napkin. He did not seem to register the spill at all. He stood frozen, his arm still awkwardly suspended in the air, his mouth slightly parted. The charming, media-trained smile had vanished, replaced by a raw, unfiltered expression of dawning terror. Wyatt released my hand and turned his head just enough to look at my brother. The billionaire expression carried no anger. Anger implies a loss of control. Wyatt merely looked at Preston the way one might observe a minor structural defect in a building foundation. 3 years ago, Wyatt began, his voice dropping into a register that commanded the attention of every soul in the dining room. Kensington Telecom suffered a coordinated ransomware strike. It hit our central dispatch servers at midnight on a holiday weekend. Every routing manifest, every rural broadband sector, every critical infrastructure node vanished behind a cryptographic lock. The guests at the table sat paralyzed. My mother, Eleanor, stared at Wyatt, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of her silk dress. She lacked the vocabulary to understand the technical terms, but she possessed a flawless instinct for shifts in social power. She knew the ground was currently giving way beneath her feet. My internal teams were paralyzed. Wyatt continued, pacing slowly behind his chair. The federal cyber units offered recovery timelines measured in weeks. Every hour my system remained locked cost the company 8 figures in broken contracts and dead networks. Then, at 2 a.m, an anonymous patch arrived in my chief security officer inbox. No name attached, just a string of executable code and an invoice. I kept my posture neutral, listening to the history I had written. "It was an elegant piece of architecture," Wyatt said, turning his gaze back to me. "It bypassed the encryption, built a temporary highway around the infected sectors, and hijacked secondary nodes to keep the grid online while the main system sat in quarantine." The alias on the invoice was VB Architect. It took my security team 2 years to track the digital fingerprint back to a specific terminal in Austin. Wyatt stepped closer to the table. Looming over Preston spilled champagne. "You call her a dropout," Wyatt said. His tone was surgical. "I call her the forensic auditor who commands a 7-figure consulting retainer. She did not fail out of her university. She left because her skills rendered the institution obsolete." I watched the color drain entirely from Preston's face. The bespoke suit he wore suddenly looked 2 sizes too large, hanging off a frame that was rapidly shrinking under the weight of the truth. This is the fundamental disconnect between my family and reality. Charles and Eleanor spent their entire lives worshiping optics. They believed success was defined by country club memberships, luxury vehicles, and the ability to project an aura of effortless prosperity. They looked at Preston and saw the perfect vessel for their vanity. He knew how to wear the expensive clothes and command a room. They raised a golden child, shielding him from every consequence, quietly covering his debts and applauding his hollow charm. They looked at me and saw a variable they could not manipulate. I did not care about the country club. I cared about raw data. I cared about the unshakable reality of numbers. When I left college, I did not explain my lucrative government contracts or the corporate bounties I collected. I allowed them to label me a failure because their approval held zero currency in my world. Their ignorance was the shield that allowed me to operate in the shadows, untethered from their toxic hierarchy. But gravity is a relentless auditor. You can dress a lie in expensive linen, you can introduce it to billionaires, but eventually the math corrects itself. "Sir," Preston choked out. His voice was thin, reedy, vibrating with a desperate need to reclaim the narrative. "Sir, I think there has been a misunderstanding. Vicky she just does minor tech support. She does not understand the complexities of corporate scaling." Wyatt did not raise his voice. He simply held up a single index finger. "You may stop talking now," Wyatt instructed. The command hit my brother like a physical blow. The golden boy, the visionary founder, swatted away like a nuisance in front of his new bride family. Preston's jaw snapped shut. He looked at his future wife, seeking a lifeline, but she was staring intently at her plate, her posture rigid with second-hand embarrassment. My father attempted to salvage the wreckage. Charles stood up, pasting on the authoritative smile he used to charm his wealth management clients. He tugged at the cuffs of his tailored shirt, desperate to reestablish the patriarchal order. "Wyatt, please," Charles said, his voice dripping with forced camaraderie. "Let us not let shop talk derail the evening. We are here to celebrate family." Wyatt looked at my father. The billionaire eyes swept over the gold Rolex, the forced smile, the sweating brow. "Family is a structure built on truth." "Charles," Wyatt replied, his tone devoid of warmth, "you spent the evening applauding a boy who builds nothing, while hiding the architect sitting at the end of your table. I have no interest in your celebration." The social inversion was absolute. The curated narrative my parents had spent 3 decades constructing shattered in less than 3 minutes. They had intended this dinner to be their coronation into the upper echelons of Texas society. Instead, it became their public execution. Wyatt turned his back on my father. He ignored Preston's outstretched, trembling hand entirely. The billionaire looked at me and gestured toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the veranda. "The air in here is stagnant," Wyatt said. "Walk with me, Vicky." He did not wait for my answer. He turned and walked toward the exit. I looked at Preston. His eyes were wide, darting frantically between me and the retreating magnate. He realized in that frozen second that his fabricated status had just evaporated. I did not offer him a sympathetic smile. I did not gloat. I simply pushed my chair back, adjusted the cuffs of my dark blazer, and walked away. I left Charles, Eleanor, and Preston stranded in the center of the silent dining room, trapped in the wreckage of their own punchline. I pushed through the glass doors, stepping out into the suffocating July heat of the Texas night. The sound of the country club vanished, replaced by the rhythmic chirp of cicadas and the hum of distant highway traffic. Wyatt was standing near the stone railing, looking out over the manicured golf course. The darkness stretched out for miles, vast and uncompromising. I stepped up beside him, keeping my posture aligned, waiting for the system to process the next command. The social execution inside the dining room was merely a prologue. Wyatt Kensington did not disrupt a rehearsal dinner simply to express his gratitude. Men who map the world in zeros and ones only initiate contact when they require a specific function. He turned his head toward me. The ambient light from the patio torches cast sharp shadows across his face. Texas land never lies. "Vicky," Wyatt said quietly, "it is the men standing on it who do." The heat on the terrace hit with the physical weight of a damp wool blanket. Dallas in July offered no reprieve, even at midnight. The air carried the heavy, stagnant scent of chlorine from the country club pool below, mixed with the sharp tang of ozone from a distant rolling thunderstorm. I let the heavy glass doors seal shut behind me, cutting off the suffocating silence of the dining room. Out here, the only sound was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of cicadas hiding in the manicured hedges. Wyatt Kensington stood near the edge of the limestone balustrade. He wore a dark, unstructured suit jacket, projecting an air of unbothered authority. Despite the oppressive humidity, he did not sweat. Men who map the world in zeros and ones Men who orchestrate corporate acquisitions the size of small nations are acclimated to pressure. He rested his hands on the cold stone railing and looked out over the sprawling, shadowed expanse of the golf course. I took my place a few feet beside him, keeping my posture aligned. I did not ask why he had dismantled my brother in front of our parents. I understood the calculus. Wyatt had waited for the precise moment when the social leverage was entirely in Preston's favor, only to invert it, testing the structural integrity of the people attempting to marry into his empire. "Your brother is an exceptional salesman," Wyatt began, his voice lacking the polite cadence required inside the building. His tone was stripped down to ice-cold arithmetic. "He sells a vision with remarkable fluidity. He looks the part. He wears the right clothes. He speaks the language of venture capital as if it were his native tongue." I kept my gaze fixed on the dark horizon. Preston had always been a salesman. While I spent my youth taking apart motherboards and building isolated local area networks, Preston was studying the art of the handshake. He leveraged our father wealth management connections to secure seed funding, trading on the family name to open doors his intellect could never unlock. Wyatt turned his head, studying my profile. "We are currently finalizing a 9-figure buyout of his agricultural technology startup," Wyatt continued. "The synergy, on paper, is flawless. My telecommunications firm is expanding our rural broadband infrastructure across the state. Your brother company claims to utilize advanced artificial intelligence to compress multispectral satellite imagery, delivering hyper-accurate crop yield predictions to farmers using our low-bandwidth networks." I nodded slowly, parsing the architecture of the deal. The concept was brilliant. Transmitting high-resolution satellite data over rural cellular towers is a logistical nightmare. If an algorithm could compress that data and run predictive analytics locally, it would revolutionize agricultural efficiency. It was a gold mine. My due diligence teams have spent the last 3 months poring over his executive summaries, Wyatt said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet suspicion. They looked at the user acquisition charts. They verified the rural engagement numbers. According to the spreadsheets Preston provided, his platform is a rocket ship. The retention rates are impeccable. The client onboarding metrics are spotless. I turned to face the billionaire. "Perfection in data is rarely organic," I noted. Wyatt offered a grim, validating nod. "Perfection is almost always a symptom of synthetic manipulation. Real systems contain friction. Hardware degrades. Users forget passwords, click the wrong prompts, and drop packets when cell towers lag. Organic growth is erratic and messy. Your brother metrics are too clean. They look engineered." He looked back out over the sprawling lawn where the artificial sprinkler systems had just engaged, spraying precise arcs of water over the grass. "Texas land never lies." "Vicky," Wyatt said, his voice carrying the distinct, heavy drawl of his upbringing. "It is the men standing on it who do." The request hung in the humid air between us. Wyatt was not merely sharing his corporate anxieties. He was a man who eliminated variables. "My internal auditors are looking at the fresh coat of paint Preston hired developers to apply to the interface," Wyatt explained. "I need someone who understands how to check the load-bearing foundation. I want you to run a shadow audit on your brother company." I remained silent, letting the parameters of the request settle into place. Auditing my own bloodline was not a standard consulting contract. It was a declaration of war. If I bypassed Preston Security and found structural rot, there would be no turning back. My parents would view it as an act of profound betrayal. They would frame it as jealousy. They would defend their golden child just as they had defended him every time he borrowed my homework, took credit for my ideas, or shoved me out of the frame in family photographs. "I need you to work independently of my formal legal teams," Wyatt instructed. "I will provide you with a backdoor authentication token that bypasses his front-end executive dashboards. You gain access to the raw, unfiltered data packets. You tell me if the asset is hollow before my daughter ties her reputation and my capital to it." I did not care about revenge. Revenge is a chaotic, emotional burn that clouds judgment. What I cared about was the unshakable reality of numbers. A flawed structure will eventually collapse, and when Preston's startup fell, it would crush anyone standing underneath it. "I need the authentication token by the time I reach Austin," I said, keeping my voice devoid of hesitation. Wyatt gave a single, decisive nod. "A secure link will be waiting in your encrypted inbox." I did not return to the dining room to say goodbye to my parents. I walked down the side steps of the terrace, handed my ticket to the valet, and merged onto Interstate 35, pointing my car south. The 200-mile drive provided a necessary buffer, allowing the residual noise of the country club to fade into the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt. By the time I unlocked the door to my apartment, the early hours of the morning had settled over the city. My living space was a study in subtraction, a physical manifestation of my disciplined mind. There were no framed photographs of family vacations. There were no decorative throw pillows or sentimental clutter. The walls were painted a flat, clinical white. The only furniture in the main room was a matte black ergonomic chair facing a custom-built processing rig. My life existed within the blue glow of 3 curved monitors. I set my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and walked directly to the workstation. I pressed the power button on the primary tower. The internal cooling fans spun to life, emitting a quiet, steady hum that sounded like logic. It sounded like a system functioning exactly as designed. The screens flared, casting sharp shadows across the dark room. I pulled my mechanical keyboard forward. The keys possessed a heavy, tactile resistance that grounded my thoughts. I opened my encrypted client portal. Wyatt Kensington had kept his word. A secure message containing a string of alphanumeric characters sat waiting. The shadow audit was authorized. The ticking clock to the merger had officially started. I cracked my knuckles and initiated the handshake protocol. I inputted the backdoor token Wyatt had provided, instructing my terminal to bypass the polished user interface of the agricultural startup. I did not want the curated pie charts or the sanitized investor dashboards. I wanted the raw, unformatted server access logs. The firewall guarding Preston Network recognized the token and parted without resistance. I was inside the perimeter. I pulled the user query metrics for the last 90 days. Millions of lines of code began to cascade down my center screen. A digital river of timestamps, localized protocol addresses, and query durations. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes unfocus slightly, waiting for my brain to catch the rhythm of the incoming information. As the packets continued to scroll, the silence in my apartment shifted into something tense and coiled. I watched the timestamps register across the server nodes, and a cold prickle of recognition traced the back of my neck. I did not need to run a complex diagnostic to see the anomaly. The rhythm was wrong. It was entirely, mathematically wrong. The 3 curved monitors illuminated my quiet apartment, casting a pale, clinical blue light across the bare white walls. I sat in my ergonomic chair, sipping black coffee, and began the meticulous process of peeling back the superficial layers of my Brother agricultural technology platform. Preston had spared no expense on the cosmetics. The executive dashboard was a masterpiece of corporate design, engineered specifically to soothe the anxieties of venture capitalists and telecom magnates. The user interface featured sleek typography and calming shades of slate and sage. Interactive graphs sloped upward in beautiful, reassuring trajectories. According to the front-end presentation, the software boasted exponential growth in rural user acquisition across the state, alongside crop yield predictions boasting a 99% accuracy rate. It looked like a billion-dollar unicorn. It looked flawless. I bypassed the polished executive summaries. Dashboards are built to tell a specific story, crafted by marketing teams to manipulate perception. I do not care about the story. I navigated to the root directory and pulled the raw server access logs for the previous 30 days. Millions of lines of code began to cascade down my center screen. It was a digital river of timestamps, protocol addresses, and user query metrics. I leaned back, letting my eyes unfocus slightly, allowing my brain to catch the underlying rhythm of the information. Organic digital traffic has a distinct texture. It breathes. Human behavior is inherently erratic, messy, and unpredictable. Real users operating out of sprawling ranches in the dusty plains of West Texas are farmers wearing heavy work gloves. They drop their devices from the cabs of their tractors. They lose cellular reception when unpredictable thunderstorms roll across the panhandle. They forget their login credentials, hesitate before clicking a prompt, and leave their sessions idling while tending to livestock. A genuine network records failed digital handshakes, variable latency, dropped packets, and chaotic session durations. The logs scrolling down my center monitor did not breathe. I highlighted a vast cluster of user accounts purportedly operating out of the agricultural sectors near Amarillo. I cross-referenced their login history with the back-end server pings. The behavior of the accounts lacked any trace of human friction. Every single query launched with mathematical precision. At exactly 3 a.m, 0 seconds, 0 milliseconds, 10,000 localized accounts initiated a handshake with the central server. They all requested a high-resolution topographical soil analysis simultaneously. The session durations lasted exactly 3.8 seconds. Then, they logged out in unison. 24 hours later, the sequence repeated. Same exact time, same exact duration. It was the sterile, unrelenting cadence of a metronome clicking in the dark. Preston did not have an exploding roster of rural enterprise clients. He was operating a massive, highly synchronized bot farm. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. The heavy, tactile resistance of the keys grounded my thoughts as I typed a series of command prompts. I needed to isolate the origin of the synthetic traffic and pry open the actual payload of these automated queries. If my brother artificial intelligence was truly analyzing soil density, topsoil erosion, and moisture levels, the output from the servers should consist of plain text statistics. I expected to see arrays of raw numerical data and environmental metrics. The packet sniffer protocol intercepted the outgoing transmission. The terminal executed the decryption sequence, translating the binary code into a visual format. The payload was not plain text. It was heavy, dense, graphical data. I pulled the rendering protocol onto my primary monitor. The screen split into 2 distinct visual feeds, running a real-time comparative analysis. On the left side of the screen, the system displayed the raw, unfiltered satellite feed sourced directly from a national geological database. It showed a vast tract of West Texas farmland. The earth was parched, fractured by severe seasonal drought, and colored in grim, unforgiving shades of cracked brown and dusty yellow. It was dead land, yielding nothing but dust. On the right side of the screen, the system displayed the output generated by Preston's proprietary artificial intelligence. It targeted the exact same geographic coordinates, but the image was entirely transformed. It was an act of digital alchemy. The cracked dirt was gone. In its place, the system displayed a vibrant, hyper-realistic expanse of lush green crops. The algorithm had analyzed the specific geometry of the barren fields and, pixel by pixel, applied a synthetic overlay. It generated the illusion of high-yield wheat and thriving corn stalks. It even calculated the correct shadows based on the time of day the satellite passed overhead, ensuring the fake vegetation looked three-dimensional and authentic to the naked eye. My brother was not utilizing predictive analytics to forecast agricultural yields. He was utilizing automated container orchestration to run generative deepfakes over the topography. He was painting a fertile mirage over a dying landscape. When telecommunications magnates like Wyatt Kensington looked at the executive dashboards, they saw a revolutionary tool bringing dead farms back to life. They saw a technological miracle capable of compressing heavy satellite data to help rural communities thrive. But the miracle was nothing more than a highly sophisticated digital painting, a lie rendered over ruined Earth. The sheer audacity of the architecture forced me to pause. The startup was a hollow shell, propped up by ghost servers generating synthetic reality. The implications of the fraud spidered outward, stretching far beyond a simple corporate buyout. If Preston presented this fabricated topographical data to investors, he was likely also using it to trick commodities brokers, federal agricultural subsidy boards, and water conservation districts. It was investor deception on an astronomical scale. I sat in the glow of the monitors, the rhythmic hum of my cooling fans mirroring the synthetic pulse of the ghost servers. As I studied the continuous loop of graphic generation, the technical marvel gave way to a cold, undeniable financial reality. Rendering high-resolution generative imagery across millions of acres of farmland is not a victimless crime against a corporate spreadsheet. It is an operation that requires immense, unrelenting computational power. You cannot run a deepfake engine of this magnitude on a standard commercial server tucked away in a closet. To sustain this illusion, the system had to render thousands of high-definition topographical maps every single hour. An offshore server farm capable of handling that processing load consumes electricity and bandwidth at a terrifying rate. You need dedicated graphics processing unit clusters operating at maximum thermal capacity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Foreign cloud hosting providers do not accept payment in charismatic smiles, tailored suits, or venture capital press releases. They require liquid currency. Based on the data flow hitting my screen, the hosting invoices required to keep the Ghost network operational would easily exceed $200,000 every month. I opened a secondary terminal window and accessed the public financial disclosures Preston had filed during his last round of investor funding. I cross-referenced the dates with his current operational burn rate. The arithmetic presented a glaring, insurmountable contradiction. Preston's initial seed capital had run dry nearly 6 months ago. According to the legitimate ledgers, his company accounts had flatlined. The venture funding was gone, the startup was officially broke. Yet, the servers were currently rendering 10,000 synthetic images per minute. The deepfake network was fully operational, churning out its lush, green lies without a single interruption. My hands hovered over the keyboard. The puzzle pieces clicked into a terrifying alignment. If my brother venture capital was exhausted and his startup was entirely devoid of legitimate revenue, someone else was secretly footing the bill. Someone was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable hard currency to an offshore hosting facility to keep the mirage alive long enough for the Kensington buyout to close. I closed the topographical feed and initiated a deep financial trace, locking onto the routing numbers hidden beneath the encrypted server payments. A single, chilling question echoed in the quiet space of my apartment. Who is funding the fraud? The cooling fans of my primary processing tower hummed, pushing heat away from the motherboard as I dug deeper into the architecture of the deepfake network. The sheer volume of computational effort required to generate thousands of synthetic satellite images per hour was staggering. I isolated the rendering engine, the core script responsible for executing the pixel-by-pixel transformation of barren dirt into lush, high-yield crops. The code scrolled down my right monitor. It was a dense, complex matrix of machine learning parameters and environmental overlays. I expected to find a polished, off-the-shelf commercial script, likely purchased from a dark web vendor and hastily customized to fit the topography of West Texas. Instead, I found something entirely different. The deeper I peeled back the cosmetic front-end commands, the more familiar the underlying structure became. The error handling protocols, the specific logic constraints dictating the shadow generation, the elegant, minimalist loops sorting the geographical data packets. I stopped scrolling. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Embedded in the core rendering header, buried beneath layers of poorly written masking code, was a single comment tag. // /VB Protocol 0. A cold prickle of recognition traced the back of my neck. That was not standard developer shorthand. It was my shorthand. VB, Vicky Barnes. Protocol 0 was a naming convention I utilized during my sophomore year at the University of Texas when I was drafting experimental reality fabricating logic on an external solid-state drive. I stared at the glowing yellow text. The anomaly bothered me like a puzzle piece forced onto the wrong board. How did my brother development team acquire my old syntax? Did they scrape an open-source repository I contributed to years ago? Did Preston hire a developer I used to study with? I opened a secondary terminal window and pulled the core logic matrix of the agricultural startup. I initiated a comparative analysis, running the startup script side by side with my own early coding architecture, the foundational frameworks I built when I was 20. The progress bar zipped across the screen. The diagnostic completed in 4 seconds. The structure was a perfect match. The memory allocation protocols matched. Even the specific, idiosyncratic structural flaws I used to make before I refined my coding style matched perfectly. The memory surfaced with striking, uninvited clarity. 3 years ago, before Preston Agricultural Technology Company existed, I was living in a cramped off-campus apartment in Austin. I was consulting covertly, building complex reality fabricating frameworks designed to test the limits of generative artificial intelligence. The raw architecture, 2 years of my proprietary, unsalaried labor, was stored on a heavy silver external drive. One Tuesday afternoon, my primary terminal froze. The silver drive registered a fatal partition error. I spent 10 hours trying to salvage the data, a tight, cold panic gripping my chest, until the drive simply stopped spinning. It was dead. Preston had walked into my apartment carrying 2 coffees, projecting the perfect image of a supportive older brother. He watched me stare at the black screen. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "It happens to the best of us. Vicky," he had said, his voice dripping with practiced empathy. "Hardware fails. Do not beat yourself up over it." He offered to take the corrupted drive to a specialized electronic waste facility in Dallas, saving me the trip so I could focus on rebuilding. I handed him the silver rectangle. I handed him 2 years of my life. Sitting in the glow of my monitors, the truth locked into place with the cold precision of a steel trap. He never took the drive to the recycling center. He took it to a cheap development firm. He paid a contractor to crack the corrupted partition, extract my raw, brilliant, generative architecture, and polish it just enough to secure his first round of seed funding. Preston did not build the artificial intelligence revolutionizing rural broadband. He stole it from the sister he publicly deemed a failure. The financial fraud, the fake topographical data, the synthetic user metrics that was a corporate crime. It was a desperate move to secure a $200 million buyout. But this discovery was different. This was an intimate, calculated betrayal. My brother had stolen my intellect, paraded it to venture capitalists as his own inherent genius, and used the resulting status to humiliate me at every family gathering. He built his towering pedestal out of my stolen labor, and then had the audacity to stand on it and ask me why I was not climbing higher. The clinical, detached professionalism I prided myself on began to fracture. It did not shatter into chaos or weeping. It crystallized into a sharp, focused wrath. My pulse steadied, slowing into a deliberate, mechanical rhythm. The dramatic irony saturating the situation was almost intoxicating. Preston had spent the entire rehearsal dinner threatening me, implying I lacked the intellectual capacity to understand complex corporate scaling. He was actively threatening to sue me for interfering in systems I supposedly could not comprehend. He was entirely unaware that he was threatening the very creator of his product. I was not just the auditor holding the structural report. I was the architect who laid the foundation. I needed to secure the proof. It is one thing to know your code was stolen. It is another to prove it in a room full of federal regulators and telecommunications lawyers. I looked down at my right hand. The worn gold of my University of Texas class ring caught the blue light of the monitors. When I was 20, deeply paranoid about the security of my experimental frameworks, I did not just password protect my files. I embedded a near-field communication cryptographic key into the resin underneath the gemstone of my class ring. It was a physical decryption token. If you did not tap the ring against the terminal reader, the time-stamped archives of my original source code remained locked behind military-grade encryption. Preston developers had managed to extract the raw logic, but they could not alter the foundational timestamps buried deep within the root directory. My original creation dates, proving the code existed 2 years before his startup was incorporated, were still there, waiting to be decrypted by the ring currently sitting on my finger. I had the weapon. I had the undeniable physical proof of the intellectual theft. I opened a fresh extraction protocol. I began mirroring the proprietary source code of the deepfake network, placing it side by side with my original time-stamped backups archived on my private cloud server. I highlighted the stolen logic loops. I mapped the exact, irrefutable matches. I was going to hand Wyatt Kensington a dossier that would not just kill the $200 million acquisition. It would erase Preston's name from the technology industry entirely. It would ensure he never raised another dollar of capital as long as he lived. I checked the digital clock on the bottom corner of my screen. It was 1:45 in the morning. The silence of my apartment was absolute, save for the low hum of the processor fans pushing heat away from the motherboard. I highlighted the final directory and prepared to initiate the secure export. But a glaring contradiction still hovered in the architecture of the fraud, demanding resolution. I pivoted my attention back to the secondary monitor, where the financial trace was still running. I had proven Preston stole the code. I had proven the crop data was synthetic. But the offshore server farm generating the deepfakes was still consuming massive amounts of bandwidth. And the invoices were still being paid. The venture capital was gone. Preston accounts were empty. Yet, the weekly wire transfers to the Nevada Shell Company never missed a Friday. If my brother was broke, who was secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable hard currency to keep the mirage alive? The terminal pinged, a sharp, singular chime cutting through the quiet room. The reverse trace had completed. The digital fog cleared. The originating account number appeared on my screen, stripped of its protective metadata. I stared at the routing prefix. The numbers did not belong to a shadow venture capital firm willing to take a high-risk gamble on a failing tech startup. They did not belong to an offshore angel investor. The breath caught in my throat. My hands stopped moving over the keyboard. I initiated a query into the Public Banking Registry database, cross-referencing the account number with regional financial institutions. The query processed in less than 10 seconds. A formal PDF document generated on my right monitor. I read the text at the top of the document. Then I read it again. The terrifying reality of the alignment settling deep into my chest. The heavy gold of my University of Texas class ring felt cold against my skin. I sat in the dim light of my Austin apartment, staring at the time-stamped evidence of my stolen architecture. The intellectual theft was a precise, calculated betrayal. My brother had repurposed my reality fabricating code to build his rural agricultural empire, leveraging my silent labor to secure his seat at the billionaire table. But as the initial shock metabolized into a cold, clinical focus, my forensic discipline overrode the personal sting. The architecture of the fraud still contained a glaring structural void. A startup is an ecosystem, and ecosystems require sustenance. To maintain the illusion of exponential growth, Preston offshore ghost servers had to continuously render synthetic satellite imagery over millions of acres of barren Texas dirt. The graphical processing units required to perform that level of digital alchemy operate at maximum thermal capacity. They consume bandwidth and electricity at a staggering velocity. Foreign cloud hosting providers do not operate on credit. They do not care about venture capital press releases, and they certainly do not care about the bespoke suits my brother wore to country club rehearsal dinners. They demand liquid currency, invoiced and paid with unyielding regularity. I opened a new diagnostic window on my left monitor and pulled the sanitized financial disclosures Preston had submitted to Wyatt Kensington due diligence team. I cross-referenced those polished spreadsheets with the raw, encrypted operational ledgers I had just extracted from the server backend. The arithmetic presented a stark, undeniable contradiction. Preston secured his initial seed funding 18 months ago, capitalizing on his charismatic pitch and our father's expansive wealth management network. But generative artificial intelligence is an expensive endeavor. According to the legitimate burn rate, Preston exhausted his venture capital in early January. The startup was insolvent. The official accounts had flatlined 6 months ago. Yet, the deepfake network was currently operating at peak capacity, churning out 10,000 synthetic crop images every single hour. I leaned forward, the mechanical switches of my keyboard clicking in rapid succession as I executed a targeted financial trace. If the company accounts were empty, someone else was secretly footing the exorbitant hosting fees to keep the Mirage operational. Someone was funneling a river of untraceable cash into the network, buying just enough time for the Kensington buyout to close and make the enterprise solvent. I bypassed the front-end ledgers and navigated directly into the raw payment gateways integrated into the startup infrastructure. My brother developers had attempted to bury the server expenses, but they lacked the necessary paranoia to hide their tracks effectively. They possessed arrogance, which is the enemy of digital security. I isolated the vendor payout logs. There it was, a clumsy, poorly disguised category labeled algorithmic research. It was a holding file for recurring outgoing payments. I decrypted the transaction history. Watching the sequence of wire transfers populate my screen every single Friday, a substantial sum of hard currency entered the startup ghost ledger and immediately bounced outward to cover the offshore hosting invoices. I needed to follow the capital upstream. Money laundering on a corporate scale relies on friction. It relies on routing funds through multiple jurisdictions to strip away the identifying metadata. I tracked the weekly Friday wire transfers backward. The money flowed through a recognized clearinghouse in Delaware, a standard tactic designed to anonymize the origin of the capital. From Delaware, the routing numbers pointed to a regional banking institution in Henderson, Nevada. I accessed the Nevada State Business Registry and pulled the incorporation documents tied to the destination account. The funds belonged to a limited liability company called Horizon Vista Holdings. It was registered to a generic post office box in a strip mall. There were no named executives, no physical office space, and no operational history. It was a textbook shell company constructed for the sole purpose of masking the true source of the cash. The scope of the operation forced me to evaluate the players involved. Preston was a salesman. He understood optics and venture capital, but he did not possess the financial architecture to construct a multi-state money laundering apparatus on his own. He needed an accomplice. He needed someone with deep, unfettered access to liquid capital and the legal authority to move it without triggering federal oversight. I initiated a reverse trace on the Nevada Shell Company, injecting a specialized diagnostic script designed to unmask the originating routing prefix before the Delaware clearinghouse scrubbed the data. The progress bar appeared on my center monitor. The system required time to pierce the encrypted layers of the banking sequence. While the algorithm worked, my thoughts drifted back to the rehearsal dinner. I pictured my father sitting at the head table. Charles Barnes built his wealth management firm on the archaic currency of handshakes, golf course deals, and unyielding patriarchal authority. For 3 decades, he cultivated an image of unshakable fiscal conservatism. He managed the retirement portfolios for retired municipal workers, teachers, and local business owners across the state of Texas. He preached financial responsibility to his clients. Yet he raised a son who treated capital like a limitless resource. At the dinner, Charles had been sweating. He had constantly adjusted the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist, his posture rigid with a suffocating, hidden anxiety. When Wyatt Kensington dismantled Preston in front of the entire room, Charles had looked terrified. It was not the terror of a father watching his son lose a business deal. It was the visceral, primal fear of a man watching his own survival slip away. A sharp chime echoed from the workstation speakers. The reverse trace had completed. The digital fog cleared from the screen. The originating account routing number appeared, stripped of its protective shell. The numbers did not belong to a shadow venture capital firm. They did not belong to a high-risk offshore angel investor willing to gamble on a failing technology startup. The prefix belonged to a regional commercial bank based in Dallas. I ran a rapid query against the public banking registry database, cross-referencing the account number. The query processed in less than 5 seconds. A formal PDF document generated on my right monitor, illuminating the dark room with a harsh white glare. I read the text at the top of the document. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I read the header again, forcing my brain to accept the grim, undeniable alignment of the data. The originating account belonged to Charles Barnes Wealth Management. The money funding the deepfake servers was not a personal loan. It was not a second mortgage on the family estate. The specific subaccount listed on the routing document belonged to a pooled pension trust. My father was not just enabling my brother. He was actively raiding the retirement funds of his elderly clients to keep the synthetic mirage alive. When Preston venture funding ran dry, he had gone to our father. He had confessed that the agricultural startup was a hollow shell, built on stolen code and fake data. And Charles, rather than forcing his golden child to face accountability, had chosen to protect the facade at any cost. Charles had used his fiduciary authority to quietly siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars from the pension portfolios he was sworn to protect. He funneled the stolen capital through the Nevada shell company to pay the offshore hosting fees. He was gambling the financial security of innocent people on the desperate hope that the Kensington buyout would close, providing enough liquid capital to quietly replace the embezzled funds before the federal regulators noticed the discrepancy. The moral weight of the discovery pressed down on my shoulders. If Wyatt Kensington rescinded the buyout, the startup would collapse. Preston would face federal indictment for investor deception and wire fraud. But the fallout would not stop there. The ensuing audit would inevitably trace the server payments back to Dallas. Charles would be exposed. He would lose his firm, his license, and his curated social standing. He would face decades in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and fiduciary embezzlement. I pushed my ergonomic chair back from the desk. I looked at the PDF document detailing the stolen pension funds. I was no longer just auditing an arrogant brother. I held the exact structural blueprints to my parents' entire destruction. But as I stared at the ledger, a different truth settled over me. The public would eventually see Charles Barnes as a monster who robbed his clients to save his son. They did not know the whole story. They did not know the secret I had buried deep within my own encrypted servers for the past 3 years. Because Charles was not the only one moving money in the dark. The PDF document glowed on my right monitor, casting a harsh, unforgiving white glare across the shadows of my apartment. Charles Barnes, the patriarch who built his entire identity on the bedrock of unwavering fiscal conservatism, was a thief. He had crossed the invisible boundary from a passive enabler to an active federal criminal. The funds flowing into the Nevada Shell Company were siphoned directly from the pooled retirement portfolios of municipal workers, county clerks, and public school teachers. These were working-class citizens who had entrusted my father with their life savings, relying on his firm handshakes, his bespoke suits, and his country club pedigree to secure their futures. Instead, he was treating their pensions as a personal slush fund to keep my brother, Synthetic Mirage, from evaporating. I did not recoil in horror. I did not gasp. When you spend your life diagnosing structural failures and predicting network collapses, panic becomes an obsolete response. I simply closed the public banking registry window. I reached across the matte surface of my desk and picked up a specialized cryptographic key, a small titanium drive no larger than a matchbook. I inserted it into the secondary port of my processing rig. The system prompted a biometric scan. I pressed my thumb against the illuminated reader, waiting for the green confirmation pulse. The terminal unlocked a hidden air-gapped partition on my local server. This was not a directory I accessed frequently. It was a digital vault I had maintained in absolute silence for 36 months. The folder contained a single master ledger. I opened the file, and a sprawling spreadsheet populated the center screen. The rows displayed a meticulous chronological record of automated wire transfers, international routing numbers, and offshore clearinghouse receipts. The dates aligned flawlessly with the lifespan of Preston Agricultural Technology startup. Here is the fundamental truth about my family. They believe they are the architects of their own destiny. They think they are steering their legacy through sheer willpower, social maneuvering, and the right strategic alliances. They are entirely oblivious to the safety net operating directly beneath their feet. I did not just discover my father embezzlement tonight. I have known about the stolen pension funds for 3 years. When Preston first launched his company using the reality fabricating algorithm he stole from my corrupted hard drive, I monitored his infrastructure out of professional curiosity. I detected the initial anomalies in his capital flow almost immediately. My father's financial architecture was archaic, full of digital blind spots that a novice forensic auditor could easily exploit. Charles began siphoning small amounts at first, assuming Preston would secure a legitimate round of venture funding to replace the borrowed capital before the end of the fiscal quarter. But synthetic ecosystems do not generate real revenue. The startup bled cash, and the unauthorized withdrawals accelerated, snowballing into a catastrophic deficit. Had the federal regulators caught the discrepancy during a routine audit, the innocent clients would have lost their retirements. Charles would have been stripped of his license, his assets seized, and he would have been sentenced to decades in a federal penitentiary. The Barnes name would have been reduced to a cautionary tale of greed and ruin splashed across the regional business papers. So I intervened, not out of misplaced daughterly devotion, and certainly not out of love. I intervened out of a clinical obligation to balance the equation and protect the collateral damage. My covert cybersecurity contracts with federal agencies and international logistics firms yielded exorbitant, untraceable bounties. I earned 7 figures for identifying zero-day vulnerabilities and patching compromised networks before the public ever knew they were threatened. I required very little of that capital to sustain my minimalist existence in Austin. Instead, I built a ghost routing script. Every month, when Charles extracted capital from the pension portfolios to pay Preston offshore hosting invoices, my script quietly triggered a corresponding deposit. I washed my own consulting fees through a series of anonymous international trusts and funneled the cash directly back into the retirement accounts Charles was raiding. I was backfilling the theft in real time. I was silently replacing the stolen money, dollar for dollar, ensuring the elderly clients never lost a fraction of a cent. For 36 months, I subsidized my family corruption. I operated as the invisible pillar holding up their crumbling roof. The irony of the rehearsal dinner settled over me, sharp and metallic. They had placed me at the back of the room near the kitchen doors. My brother had pointed a customized champagne flute at me and introduced me to a telecommunications billionaire as a dropout. My mother had laughed, eager to distance herself from my existence. My father had adjusted his expensive watch, desperate to project an aura of superiority. They treated me like a defective component, entirely unaware that the person they were openly abusing was the sole reason they were not wearing handcuffs. They despised me, yet they survived strictly on my unreported charity. They drove luxury vehicles and hosted elite country club dinners, using the financial breathing room I secretly provided. The moral clarity of the situation was now absolute. I had protected the innocent pensioners, shielding them from Charles' desperation. But I was no longer willing to underwrite the fraud. The impending Kensington buyout forced my hand. If Wyatt injected $200 million into Preston Hollow Shell, the contagion would spread, infecting a legitimate empire. The lie had reached its maximum load-bearing capacity. It was time to pull the support beams and let gravity do its work. My clinical detachment solidified into a weapon. I initiated a rapid compilation protocol. I gathered the stolen generative artificial intelligence code, the time-stamped deepfake server logs, and the undeniable proof of Charles' original embezzlement trail. I packaged the data into a single, heavily encrypted dossier, prepping it for presentation. I would hand Wyatt Kensington the exact dimensions of the rot, but networks are highly sensitive environments, and aggressive extractions leave ripples. While pulling the final terabyte of server access logs from Preston backend architecture, my diagnostic script required a prolonged handshake with his master node. The bandwidth spike was microscopic. It lasted only a fraction of a second, an invisible fluctuation in a sea of synthetic traffic. However, it generated a localized micro-latency alert in the startup primary firewall. I watched the red warning indicator flash briefly on my left monitor before the system stabilized. The trap was set, and the dossier was complete. But the prey was not entirely blind. 200 miles away, in a luxury hotel suite in Dallas, an automated security notification pinged on my brother's smartphone. Preston might not possess the intellect to build an artificial intelligence, but he possessed the paranoid instincts of a cornered thief. The golden child was about to realize that a predator was moving silently through his house. The micro-latency alert that triggered in Dallas was a digital whisper, a fractional delay measuring less than 4 milliseconds. For a legitimate technology firm, it would register as standard network friction. But Preston was operating a synthetic mirage. In his world, any anomaly was a klaxon sounding the alarm of impending discovery. 200 miles separated his luxury hotel suite in Dallas from my minimalist apartment in Austin. That meant my brother had to spend 3 hours driving south through the dead of night, his paranoia compounding with every passing mile marker along the interstate. The knock came at 2 a.m. It was not a polite, rhythmic tap. It was the frantic, heavy impact of closed fists striking solid wood, the sound vibrating through the floorboards of my living space. I did not flinch. I pushed my ergonomic chair away from the monitors, the digital glow of the intercepted pension ledgers reflecting against the stark white walls. I walked down the narrow hallway, my bare feet silent against the hardwood. I reached the entryway and peered through the glass lens of the peephole. The fisheye distortion warped the corridor, but the figure pacing on the landing was unmistakable. Preston looked nothing like the polished executive who had commanded the rehearsal dinner just hours earlier. The bespoke linen jacket was wrinkled, discarded over one arm. His tie was loosened, the top buttons of his crisp shirt torn open as if he had been struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs. Sweat glistened on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the apartment hallway. I engaged the heavy brass security chain before turning the deadbolt. I pulled the door open just enough to fill the narrow gap, keeping my body anchored behind the solid wood. Preston jolted at the sudden movement. He stepped forward, attempting to use his height and physical presence to force his way into my domain. The brass chain pulled taut, stopping him inches from my face. "Open the door, Vicky," he demanded. His voice lacked the smooth baritone he utilized for venture capital pitches. It was thin, vibrating with suppressed hysteria. "We need to talk right now." I rested my hands loosely by my sides, keeping my posture neutral. "We are talking," I replied. "State your business." He let out a short, jagged breath, looking up and down the empty corridor, paranoid that my neighbors might be listening. "What game are you playing?" he hissed, leaning closer to the gap. The sharp scent of expensive cologne mixed with the sour tang of nervous sweat washed over me. You show up at my dinner. You whisper in Wyatt Kensington's ear, and then my server ping logs light up with unauthorized extraction requests. What did you say to him? I remained silent. In any interrogation, silence is the heaviest weapon in the arsenal. Human nature abhors a vacuum. People will inevitably rush to fill the void, and in their rush, they reveal their true baseline. Preston could not handle the quiet. His eyes darted across my face, searching for a tell, a flinch, a sign of the submissive sister he had spent his entire life conditioning. He found nothing. The absence of my reaction infuriated him. He pivoted to his default strategy, deploying intimidation disguised as condescension. You think you are so clever, he sneered, gripping the edge of the doorframe, his knuckles turned white from the strain. You sit in this dark little box staring at screens, and you think you understand how the real world operates? You have always been delusional. Optics matter, relationships matter. I built an empire while you were debugging mainframes for hourly wages. He leaned closer, his breath hot against the crack in the doorway. You are trying to sabotage the biggest deal of my life because you are jealous. You cannot stand the fact that Dad respects me. And if you try to ruin this merger with whatever petty technical glitch you think you found, I will make sure you never work in the technology sector again. I have investors. I have lawyers. I will crush you. I listened to the tirade, mapping the emotional trajectory of his words. It was a classic gaslighting maneuver. Attack the credibility, project the insecurity, and threaten the livelihood. Years ago, those words might have found a vulnerability. Tonight, they sounded like a predictable algorithm executing a faulty command. Are you finished? I asked. He blinked, thrown off balance by the lack of defense. He opened his mouth to launch another threat, but I cut him off, my tone flat and measured. I did not go hunting for glitches. Preston. I was hired to conduct a shadow audit. I pulled the packet data for your user acquisition metrics. You do not have enterprise clients. You have a cyclical bot farm running automated container orchestration. You are masking synthetic traffic to inflate your daily active user count. His jaw locked. A muscle jumped near his temple. And synthetic traffic requires capital, I continued, driving the cold arithmetic into the structure of his lies. You ran out of seed funding months ago, so every Friday you wire the hosting fees through a clearinghouse in Delaware, account ending in 7742, Horizon Vista Holdings, Henderson, Nevada. The numbers struck him with the force of physical blows. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His hands fell away from the doorframe. The bluster, the arrogance, the polished founder persona evaporated into the stagnant air of the hallway. He was no longer the apex predator of the family. He was a cornered thief, staring at the auditor who held the ledger. He stepped back, his chest heaving. He pivoted to the last resort of a guilty man. He played the victim. "Vicky, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You do not understand the pressure. Dad was breathing down my neck, expecting perfection. I just needed a head start. A temporary boost to secure the next round of funding. Once the Kensington buyout clears, I can shut the ghost servers down. I can hire real developers to build the actual product. No one would ever know." "You could not build the actual product," I stated, slicing through his justification, "because you do not know how. You stole my reality fabricating code from a corrupted hard drive 3 years ago. You built your pedestal out of my stolen labor." Tears welled in his eyes, a desperate, manipulative display of remorse. "I knew your code was brilliant. I knew it could change the industry. We are family, Vicky. If Wyatt finds out, he will cancel the acquisition. He will file a federal report. I will go to prison. You would be destroying my life." I studied his face, cataloging the profound lack of accountability. He still believed he was the victim of circumstance. Gravity does not care about family loyalty, I said. You built a skyscraper on a cracked foundation. The collapse is a mathematical certainty. I am just the person holding the structural report. I unhooked the chain guard, causing him to step back in anticipation, then grabbed the edge of the door and swung it shut. The heavy wood slammed closed. I turned the deadbolt, the loud metallic clank echoing through my entryway. I moved toward the peephole and looked through the glass lens. Preston stood in the hallway for a long, agonizing minute. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped in defeat. But then, the posture of despair shifted. His head snapped up, his jaw clenched, the muscles working furiously under the skin. The terror evaporated, replaced by a cornered, vindictive focus. He realized begging would not work. He realized I could not be manipulated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. His thumb moved rapidly across the illuminated screen. He was not looking for a solution. He was looking for a weapon. He was initiating a preemptive strike. I stepped away from the door and walked back into my home office. The parameters of the conflict had shifted. Preston was a salesman, and when a salesman cannot fix a defective product, he attacks the credibility of the reviewer. He was going to control the narrative before I could present my data. I sat down in my ergonomic chair. I opened a secure communication channel linked to the shadow audit protocol Wyatt had established. Earlier in the evening, I had embedded a packet sniffer to monitor the external communications routing out of Preston corporate servers. Within 20 minutes, the automated threat monitoring system pinged. A high-priority email had just cleared the servers. The sender was Preston. The recipient was the Chief of Human Resources at Kensington Telecom, with a blind copy sent directly to Wyatt Executive Legal Counsel. I initiated an interception protocol and decrypted the email body. I read the text on my center screen, mapping the architecture of my brother smear campaign. It was a masterpiece of corporate character assassination. Preston did not sound angry or vindictive in the email. He adopted the tone of a burdened, loving brother forced to make a difficult professional decision. He claimed that I was a disgruntled former college dropout who had recently suffered a severe mental health crisis. He stated that I harbored a delusional fixation on his success and was known to fabricate data to damage reputations. He strongly advised the Kensington executive team to disregard any communication or unsolicited audits I might submit, citing a history of erratic behavior and vindictive sabotage. He was framing me as a liability before I could frame him as a fraud. He knew that in the high-stakes environment of a $200 million merger, corporate legal teams err on the side of caution. If Human Resources flagged me as a potential lawsuit risk or a compromised source, Wyatt might be forced by his own board of directors to dismiss my findings entirely to protect their due diligence process. The strategy was ruthless, but it relied on a critical flaw in Preston logic. He assumed I was playing the same social game he was. He assumed I would react to the smear campaign by panicking, calling Wyatt to defend myself, or initiating a messy public dispute to clear my name. I did none of those things. When someone attacks your credibility, defending yourself only validates their premise. Instead of fighting the narrative, I decided to use it against him. I needed unshakable, legally binding proof of Preston's direct involvement in the deepfake servers. The Nevada shell company routing numbers proved the fraud existed, but Preston could always blame a rogue chief financial officer or a corrupt developer. He had insulated himself from the daily operational code. To pin the entire structure to him, I needed an action executed directly from his master administrator account. I needed his unforgeable digital fingerprint on the crime. To get that, I had to make him drop his guard. I had to give him a victory. I had to let him believe his smear campaign had worked and that my sophisticated shadow audit had been reduced to a desperate, petty grievance. I cracked my knuckles, aligning my fingers over the keyboard, and began to construct the bait. I stared at the decrypted text of Preston email to the Kensington Human Resources Department. The smear campaign was a precise, calculated maneuver. By framing me as an unstable, disgruntled sibling with a history of erratic behavior, he was attempting to build a legal quarantine around my impending audit. In the high-stakes environment of a $200 million corporate acquisition, legal teams operate on risk aversion. If the human resources executives flagged my profile as a potential liability, Wyatt Board of Directors might force him to discard my data to protect their due diligence process. If I fought the narrative directly, I would inevitably validate his premise. Defending my sanity to a room full of corporate lawyers would only make me appear defensive and hysterical. I required a different vector of attack. I needed a weapon immune to plausible deniability. In the architecture of white-collar fraud, the chief executive officer rarely writes the illicit code. They insulate themselves beneath layers of plausible ignorance. If I handed Wyatt the deepfake server logs right now, Preston would simply deploy the ultimate corporate shield. He would claim he was defrauded by his own staff. He would sacrifice a mid-level software engineer, feign outrage, and argue that a rogue developer built the synthetic traffic loop without his knowledge. To pin the entire fabricated ecosystem directly to his chest, I needed his unforgeable digital signature stamped onto the Ghost server directory. I needed undeniable proof that the architect of the company actively managed the lie. To secure that signature, I had to force him to drop his guard. I had to give him a false victory. I navigated away from the deepfake rendering engine and the encrypted offshore hosting invoices. Fraudsters are rarely undone by their most complex schemes. They trip over their pettiest indulgences. I pivoted my focus toward the mundane operational ledgers of the startup. I bypassed the critical infrastructure and accessed the executive expense portal. I applied a targeted filter, scanning for irregularities in my brother's personal corporate spending over the previous fiscal year. The search yielded fruit in less than 3 minutes. I highlighted a clustered series of transactions originating from a 5-star alpine resort in Aspen, Colorado. The expenditures totaled $15,000, logged during the second week of February. Preston had categorized the charges under the label of a client acquisition summit. I opened a secondary diagnostic window and cross-referenced the dates of the Aspen transactions with the metadata extracted from his public social media profiles. The geolocation tags on his uploaded photographs painted a very different reality. There were no agricultural clients. There were no telecommunications executives. The visual data showed Preston drinking vintage champagne in a heated infinity pool surrounded by his former fraternity brothers. It was micro-embezzlement. In the context of a 9-figure merger, $15,000 is a rounding error. It is a fractional discrepancy. But to a narcissist obsessed with projecting an aura of flawless execution, it is a glaring, unacceptable blemish. I formulated the trap. I drafted a formal compliance anomaly report within the internal startup due diligence portal. I attached the itemized Aspen receipts, highlighted the date discrepancies, and flagged the transactions as unauthorized personal luxury expenses requiring immediate executive review. I did not mention the artificial intelligence. I did not reference the reality fabricating algorithm, the offshore server farm, or the stolen pension funds. I framed the entire scope of my inquiry around stolen ski lift tickets and overpriced resort tabs. I clicked Submit. The alert routed directly to Preston Administrative Inbox. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and visualized the psychological sequence about to unfold in that Dallas hotel suite. Preston would read the notification. The initial spike of pure panic would dissolve rapidly into arrogant relief. He would assume that this petty expense violation was the absolute limit of my capability. He would conclude that my grand threat at the apartment door was a bluff, the desperate gambit of an inferior mind grasping at straws. Most importantly, he would believe that his preemptive smear campaign had worked. He would assume my technical skills peaked at auditing travel receipts. He would laugh. But my brother possessed a fragile vanity. He was a man who spent his entire adult life curating an illusion of perfection. His hubris would dictate his next move. He could not tolerate a compliance flaw reaching Wyatt legal counsel in the morning. He would want the anomaly erased. He would want the ledger pristine. To alter a flagged compliance document within the corporate architecture, a standard user profile is insufficient. The system protocols require a top-tier override. Preston would have to log into the network using his master admin credentials. He would have to utilize his God Mode token. When a user initiates a master admin login, the internal security firewalls briefly lower their shields to permit the cryptographic handshake. It creates a fractional window of vulnerability in the core server architecture. I did not need to break the door down. I just needed my brother to unlock it from the inside. I pulled my mechanical keyboard closer and opened a fresh terminal window. My fingers moved in a steady, deliberate rhythm as I coded a silent packet sniffer. I designed the script to remain dormant, hiding seamlessly within the ambient background noise of the network traffic. The exact moment the God Mode token authenticated, my script would piggyback on the secure session, riding his encrypted credentials straight into the root directory. I finalized the syntax and deployed the code. I parked the digital snare right outside the primary firewall of the AgTech startup. The digital clock on my secondary monitor read 2 a.m. The physical space of my apartment felt still and heavy. The only sound in the room was the steady whir of the cooling fans drawing heat away from my processing rig. I reached for my ceramic mug and took a sip of black coffee. It was cold and bitter, matching the texture of the hour. The waiting is the crucible of any audit. If Preston decided to ignore the expense report, the trap would starve. If he fell asleep, trusting his smear campaign to protect him, the ticking clock to the morning merger meeting would expire. My snare would remain empty, and I would lack the unassailable proof required to destroy his plausible deniability. But I knew the structural integrity of his ego. I knew the specific gravity of his arrogance. He could not leave a flaw uncorrected. He would protect the superficial paint job, entirely unaware that the foundation was wired to detonate. I sat in the darkness, watching the cursor blink on the black screen. I kept my breathing slow and even, matching the quiet rhythm of the machine, waiting for the golden child to make a fatal error. The digital clock in the corner of my secondary monitor flipped from 2:13 to 2:14. The physical environment of my apartment felt like a sensory deprivation chamber, a tomb of white walls and humming processor fans. I sat perfectly still, my breathing synchronized with the low, mechanical whir of the cooling unit. The snare was set, the bait was deployed. I just needed the target to walk into the clearing. A sudden flash of green syntax illuminated the terminal. The packet sniffer script I parked outside the startup firewall detected a highly encrypted handshake request. Someone was knocking on the back-end door of the network. The incoming protocol address routed through a virtual private network, but the origin node matched the localized cellular tower servicing a luxury hotel in downtown Dallas. It was him. The authentication sequence processed on my screen. Standard user accounts enter a corporate network through the front gate, leaving a trail of sanitized breadcrumbs and restricted access logs. This specific login bypassed the exterior entirely. It utilized a top-tier cryptographic token, a God Mode credential restricted exclusively to the chief executive officer. Preston had taken the bait. His vanity could not abide a compliance flaw reaching Wyatt Kensington in the morning. He had to erase the evidence of his stolen ski trip. The moment his master credential lowered the internal security shields to initiate the secure session, my dormant script engaged. It attached itself to his encrypted wake like a remora clinging to a shark. I was inside the root directory, riding his clearance level straight past the intrusion detection protocols. A thin status bar materialized at the bottom of my center monitor, tracking the data extraction. 1%. The crawl was agonizing. I watched the numerical values tick upward, forced to endure the rigid physical limitations of bandwidth constraints. 4%. My fingers gripped the armrests of my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. If Preston realized what was happening, if he severed the connection before the extraction reached completion, the script would starve. I would be locked out, and the digital fingerprint I needed to prove his culpability would evaporate. I monitored his keystrokes in real time, mapping his behavior through the server logs. He navigated through the executive ledgers with erratic speed. He was rushing, driven by the adrenaline of a cornered animal trying to cover its tracks. He located the compliance anomaly report I filed earlier in the night. He opened the folder containing the $15,000 Aspen Resort receipts. I watched his cursor hover over the directory. He did not pause to review the files. He initiated a permanent deletion sequence. 9%. 12%. The status bar dragged across the screen, a slow, crawling line of pixels deciding the fate of a $200 million corporate merger. My jaw clenched. I needed 3 full minutes of uninterrupted access. Preston was moving too fast. He highlighted the ledger entry confirming the scrub command. Here is the fatal flaw in my brother design. Preston lacked a fundamental understanding of network architecture. He was a salesman, a man who believed software was just a series of sleek buttons performing magic tricks for investors. His entire life, Charles and Eleanor shielded him from the mechanics of hard work. They bought his tutors. They funded his failed ventures. They hired subcontractors to do the heavy lifting while he took the credit. He viewed his master admin token as a magic wand, an instrument that granted him unquestioned authority over the digital realm. He did not comprehend the underlying mechanics of a database override. When you force a permanent deletion in a live financial ledger, the system does not simply erase the file and move on. The architecture requires an automatic synchronization check to balance the internal accounting state. To execute the scrub, Preston God Mode token was forced to authenticate against the active server directory. In his desperate rush to hide the stolen champagne and luxury resort tabs, he bypassed the standard security sandbox. He authorized a blanket synchronization command to force the deletion through the network. By doing so, the system permanently stamped his irrevocable digital signature directly onto the active sector of the infrastructure. That specific active sector housed the generative artificial intelligence scripts. It housed the offshore server payment gateways. It housed the deep fake traffic. 24%, 48%, 89%. The extraction script pulled the synchronized logs, capturing the metadata before the internal firewall could recognize the anomaly and trigger a quarantine. 100%. The download chime echoed in the quiet room, a crisp, singular note of victory. On the other end of the connection, Preston verified the deletion of his ski trip. The compliance report vanished from his dashboard. Believing he had successfully outsmarted the audit and protected his fragile facade, he initiated a log-off command. The master session terminated. The internal firewalls slammed shut, locking the root directory down tight. The microsecond window closed. He was gone. Preston Barnes likely went to sleep in his Dallas hotel suite, convinced his smear campaign had neutralized my threat and his swift keystrokes had secured the Kensington acquisition. He was entirely unaware he had just handed his sister his own execution order. I severed my connection to the external node and pulled the extracted payload onto my local drive. I opened the file. The metadata was flawless. There, embedded in the raw server logs, was his unique cryptographic identifier, permanently linked to the fraud. He could no longer claim ignorance. He could no longer blame a rogue developer or a careless financial officer. The signature proved the chief executive officer had direct, intentional knowledge of the synthetic traffic and chose to bypass it merely to hide a petty theft. The clinical detachment I utilized to navigate the digital world shifted into a cold, mechanical focus. I initiated the final compilation. I gathered the stolen reality fabricating code, comparing it side by side with my original time-stamped architecture. I appended the deepfake server logs, showcasing the metronome rhythm of the bot farm. I attached the unmasked wire transfers, tracking the offshore payments back to Charles' embezzled pension portfolios. Finally, I placed Preston Master Admin's signature at the top of the file, binding the entire ecosystem of lies directly to his chest. I packaged the data into a single, highly encrypted dossier. I locked the file and transferred it to a secure, solid-state tablet. The weapon was forged. It was unassailable. It relied on no emotions, no familial loyalty, and no subjective interpretations. It was pure, distilled arithmetic. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked over to the window. The sky over Austin was beginning to bleed from pitch black into a bruised metallic blue. The dawn was breaking. The merger signing was scheduled for 9 in the morning at an elite venue outside Houston. I turned away from the window, walking toward my closet to select a tailored charcoal suit. It was understated, tailored to fit perfectly, offering no unnecessary flourishes. It was the armor of a professional auditor. I tied my hair back, slid my feet into polished heels, and picked up my encrypted tablet. The dossier rested securely on the drive, waiting for an audience. I was ready to deliver the structural report. But a family built on decades of manipulation does not surrender quietly. They deploy their heaviest artillery when cornered. And the patriarch was already moving into position to protect his own survival. The Texas sun broke over the horizon, painting the expansive highway in harsh, unforgiving shades of amber and white. The morning of the merger had arrived. I drove south toward Houston, keeping my speed precisely aligned with the flow of early commuter traffic. The encrypted solid-state tablet rested on the passenger seat beside me, a heavy, silent testament to the arithmetic of ruin. Wyatt Kensington had not scheduled the final signing to occur in a sterile corporate boardroom. He had arranged for the execution of the contracts to take place at the Texas Heritage Land Auction. It was a highly deliberate choice of venue. The Heritage Auction was an arena dedicated to generational wealth, a place where cattle tycoons, oil barons, and real estate developers traded physical, undeniable acres. Land is finite. Land is tangible. You can run dirt through your fingers. It was the perfect, contrasting stage for Wyatt to evaluate an agricultural technology startup built entirely on synthetic data and vaporware. I navigated my modest sedan down the concrete ramp into the subterranean parking structure beneath the auction house. The air below ground was stagnant, thick with the smell of damp cement and premium unleaded exhaust. The harsh fluorescent tube lights buzzed overhead, casting long, warped shadows across the rows of armored luxury utility vehicles and pristine vintage sports cars. I pulled into an empty space, turned off the ignition, and picked up the tablet. My tailored charcoal suit felt like a layer of necessary armor. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the primary elevator bank. The rhythmic click of my heels echoed off the low ceiling, announcing my approach. As I neared the steel doors, a figure detached itself from the shadows of a wide concrete pillar. It was my father. Charles Barnes stood directly in my path. He wore a navy double-breasted suit, the fabric cut and stitched to project unassailable dominance. But the physical tailoring failed to mask his rapid psychological decay. The man who usually commanded wealth management seminars with a booming, authoritative baritone looked ashen. His skin carried a sickly gray undertone. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist hung loosely, as though the underlying muscle had atrophied overnight. He was a king stripped of his court, reduced to lurking in a subterranean garage to ambush his own daughter. He stepped forward, placing his body between me and the elevator call button. I expected him to deploy his usual booming reprimand. Instead, his voice dropped into a desperate conspiratorial whisper. He abandoned his lifelong shield of plausible deniability. He knew Preston was cornered. And he knew I possessed the structural report. "You cannot do this, Vicky," Charles said. His eyes darted toward the encrypted tablet in my hand, tracking it like a loaded weapon. I stopped walking. I maintained a neutral posture, offering him no emotional traction. "State your business," I replied. Charles swallowed hard, his throat working against the starched collar of his shirt. "You made your point. You proved you are smarter than your brother. You proved you can breach his security systems. I acknowledge your intellect. Now you need to hand over that drive and walk away before you cause permanent damage to this family." I observed the desperation leaking from his pores. He still believed the conflict was rooted in petty sibling rivalry. He thought I was throwing a digital tantrum to demand the attention he had denied me for nearly 3 decades. He lacked the capacity to understand that gravity does not negotiate. I was not seeking his validation. I was delivering a mathematical correction. When my silence stretched, failing to produce the submissive flinch he anticipated, Charles escalated his tactics. The patriarch deployed his ultimate weapon. "If you walk into that auction hall and disrupt this buyout, you are finished," he warned. His whisper hardened into a jagged edge. "I will excise your name from the family trust. You will be erased from the legacy. You will never receive a single cent of the Barnes estate. You will lose your standing, your access, and your future. I will leave you with nothing." The threat hung in the damp, exhaust-filled air of the garage. To any other child raised in the suffocating embrace of high society, the prospect of total financial abandonment would trigger visceral panic. It was the ultimate exile. But for me, the threat triggered a profound, clinical amusement. My father was threatening to cut me out of a trust fund he had already drained to zero. He was threatening to deny me a financial legacy I was secretly funding with my own cybersecurity bounties. He stood there, puffing out his chest in a designer suit, attempting to intimidate the very person who had been quietly paying off the debts of his federal embezzlement for 36 months. He was wielding a hollow gun, threatening to evict me from a house that was already in foreclosure. I did not smile. I did not betray my secret. The structural integrity of his leverage simply dissolved in front of my eyes. Seeing that his threat failed to register on my face, Charles pivoted rapidly. The enabler always carries a carrot to follow the stick. His rigid posture softened, attempting to mimic a warm, paternal affection he had never authentically possessed. "It does not have to end in destruction," he whispered. He reached a hand out as if to touch my shoulder. I took a deliberate step backward, remaining out of his physical reach. His hand fell back to his side. "Preston understands your value now," Charles continued, his tone shifting into a frantic sales pitch. "I understand your value. We are prepared to offer you a permanent seat at the table. When the Kensington Capital clears the accounts this morning, Preston will restructure the executive board. He will appoint you as the vice president of systems architecture. We are talking about a mid-6-figure salary. You will receive premium stock options. You will have a corner office in the new downtown headquarters. You will finally have the respect you always wanted." I looked at the man who had mortgaged the retirement portfolios of innocent public school teachers and municipal workers just to buy his son a fake empire. He was trying to purchase my silence, using the very capital he was attempting to steal from Wyatt Kensington. He was offering me a prominent executive title on a vessel that was actively taking on water, hoping my technical brilliance could somehow patch the holes before the federal regulators noticed the leak. "You think protecting a fraud is a valid business strategy?" I said. My voice was steady, echoing clearly off the cold concrete walls. "You think hiding a fatal structural flaw is a display of family loyalty?" Charles opened his mouth to argue, but I sliced through his defense. "A liability does not become an asset just because you put my name on the door," I stated. The blood drained entirely from my father's face. He stared at me, the realization crashing over him that his daughter operated on an incorruptible currency. He had spent his life dealing with people who could be bought, threatened, or socially engineered. He had no protocol for a person who only valued the truth. "I am the auditor," I concluded. I stepped around his frozen frame and pressed the elevator call button. The steel doors slid open with a quiet, mechanical hum. I walked into the cab and turned around to face the garage. Charles stood alone in the dim light. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides. The bespoke suit offered no protection against the impending ruin. He realized the transaction had failed. He realized he had nothing left to bargain with. And the protective barrier he had built around his golden child was officially breached. The steel doors slid shut, severing his access to me. The elevator ascended toward the main floor of the auction house. The ideological battle was concluded. The enablers had exhausted their arsenal of manipulation and bribery. I tightened my grip on the encrypted solid-state drive. Above me, the elite Texas land auction was already underway. Preston was preparing to aggressively bid on prime real estate, intending to use the pending telecommunications buyout to legitimize his fabricated wealth in front of the state's most powerful brokers. He was about to step onto a highly public stage, entirely unaware that the architect of his destruction had just arrived to balance the ledger. The Texas Heritage Land Auction House was a cathedral built for generational wealth. The air inside the sprawling hall smelled of polished mahogany, aged leather, and the distinct metallic scent of high-stakes adrenaline. Vaulted ceilings amplified the steady, rhythmic chant of the auctioneer. Rows of stadium seating were filled with cattle tycoons, oil executives, and real estate brokers. These were men and women who traded in finite, physical reality: dirt, aquifers, mineral rights. In the center of the front row sat my brother. Preston wore a slate gray bespoke suit, his posture radiating a manufactured invincibility. He held a numbered bidding paddle loosely in his right hand. He was actively attempting to purchase 10,000 acres of prime agricultural real estate in the Panhandle. It was a calculated theatrical performance. By aggressively acquiring top-tier land in front of the state's most powerful brokers, he intended to legitimize his agricultural technology startup. He was leveraging the impending $200 million telecommunications buyout to cement his status as a titan of industry. Wyatt Kensington sat in the elevated private gallery above the auction floor, flanked by a phalanx of corporate lawyers. The billionaire looked down at the bidding war with an unreadable, stoic expression. He was waiting for the structural report. Preston raised his paddle. The auctioneer's rapid cadence spiked. "We have 12 million, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. 12 million from the gentleman in the front row. Do I hear 12.5? Preston offered a casual, arrogant smile to the competing bidder across the aisle, a veteran rancher who was currently wiping sweat from his brow. My brother was playing with phantom capital, spending Wyatt future acquisition funds before the ink on the contract even existed. "Going once at 12 million, the auctioneer announced. He raised his polished wooden gavel. The heavy mallet hung suspended in the air. I did not yell to halt the proceedings. I did not cause a chaotic disruption. I simply walked down the central aisle, the rhythmic click of my heels cutting through the tension of the room, and stepped directly up to the presentation podium positioned beneath the primary auction screens. The audio-visual technician standing beside the console frowned, reaching out to stop me. I ignored him. I placed my encrypted solid-state tablet onto the reading surface and drove a connection cable into the primary display port. The massive digital screens flanking the auctioneer flickered. The high-definition photographs of the Panhandle real estate vanished. The screens flared with a stark, blinding white background, followed immediately by a dense, scrolling cascade of raw server access logs. A wave of confusion washed over the audience of brokers and tycoons. Preston lowered his bidding paddle. His arrogant smile froze, his eyes darting from the screens to the podium. When he saw me standing there, the color drained from his face, leaving his skin the texture of wet chalk. This is the executive summary of the asset currently driving the bidding. I stated into the podium microphone. My voice was level, echoing cleanly across the cavernous hall. The startup attempting to purchase this land claims to utilize artificial intelligence to compress satellite imagery and predict crop yields. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The presentation shifted. The displays split into a dual visual feed. On the left, the raw geological satellite imagery of barren, cracked Texas dirt. On the right, the exact same coordinates overlaid with lush, hyper-realistic green crops. What you are looking at is not predictive analytics, I explained to the room. This is a generative deepfake engine. The company is executing automated container orchestration to paint synthetic vegetation over dead land. There are no enterprise clients. There is no revolutionary compression algorithm. The entire valuation is a hollow shell, sustained by a cyclical bot farm operating out of an offshore server network. The silence in the auction hall was deafening. Wealthy investors do not tolerate being treated as fools. The collective gaze of the room shifted from the screens directly to Preston. Preston shot out of his chair. The heavy leather seat tipped backward, colliding with the row behind him. "This is a gross mischaracterization," Preston shouted, his voice pitching upward into a frantic, reedy tone. He pointed a trembling finger at the podium. "Do not listen to her. This is an industry-standard scaling strategy. We are running a simulated load. It is a stress test for the user interface. We simulate network load to calibrate the topographical mapping. She does not understand complex machine learning." He turned toward the elevated gallery, seeking a lifeline from the telecom magnate. "Wyatt, this is a stunt. She breached our testing environment to frame me. She is the disgruntled former student who does not understand the code." I waited for him to finish his desperate rationalization. The defense relied on his ability to cast me as an ignorant outsider, a minor nuisance who stumbled into a sandbox she could not comprehend. He still believed he controlled the narrative. I lifted my right hand. The worn gold of my University of Texas class ring caught the harsh glare of the podium spotlights. I did not breach the testing environment. "Preston," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "I built the architecture you are currently using to commit fraud." I pressed the face of my class ring directly against the near-field communication reader embedded in my tablet. The cryptographic key hidden within the resin of the ring initiated a handshake with the encrypted dossier. The security protocol verified the physical token. On the massive screens above us, the deepfake imagery collapsed, replaced by the root directory of the startup core rendering engine. The system highlighted a single line of hidden syntax, VB Protocol 0. Then, the decryption key unlocked the foundational timestamps buried deep within the architecture. The dates flashed across the displays in bold, undeniable text. "The algorithm driving this network was authored 36 months ago," I announced, ensuring every broker and lawyer in the room absorbed the timeline. It was written 2 full years before this company was incorporated. The code was stored on a physical drive my brother claimed to have recycled after a partition failure. The asset you are attempting to leverage today was not developed by a visionary founder. It was extracted from my stolen hardware. The reality of the intellectual theft settled over the room like a physical weight. Preston's bespoke suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. His jaw worked silently, attempting to formulate another lie, but the mechanical precision of the timestamp data offered no oxygen for his excuses. From the elevated gallery, the lead corporate counsel for Kensington Telecom leaned over the railing. The lawyer possessed cold, gray eyes and an expression carved from granite. "Sit down and close your mouth," Mr. Barnes, the lawyer, instructed. The command was delivered without raising a single decibel, yet it carried the unyielding force of a judge issuing a sentence. Preston's legs gave out. He sank back into his upright chair, his hands shaking in his lap. The golden child was shattered. The illusion of his genius was permanently erased, dismantled by the sister he had publicly labeled a dropout. But the execution was only half complete. The intellectual theft invalidated the product, and the deepfake engine proved the investor deception. However, the ecosystem required one final structural report. The offshore servers generating the synthetic traffic were still running, which meant the capital sustaining the fraud had to be exposed. I turned my gaze away from my broken brother and scanned the room, locating my father sitting 3 rows behind him. Charles was gripping the wooden pew in front of him. The knuckles on his hands were stark white. He knew exactly what data point remained on my tablet. He realized the intellectual theft was merely the prelude to a much darker systemic rot. The atmosphere in the auction hall was dense, suffocating under the weight of the exposed intellectual theft. Preston sat ruined in the front row, the polished veneer of the golden child entirely stripped away. The elite brokers and cattle tycoons whispered among themselves, the social order recalibrating in real time. But my duty was not complete. The reality fabricating algorithm was merely the mechanism of the lie. The engine required fuel, and the fuel was stolen. I did not pause to let my brother absorb his destruction. The forensic momentum demanded the ledger be balanced in full. I tapped the screen of my tablet, clearing the digital signature and the root directory from the primary displays. The screens flashed again, transitioning from code architecture to financial ledgers. The execution is not yet complete, I announced into the microphone. A hollow asset requires capital to maintain the illusion of density. Generating synthetic vegetation over millions of acres demands massive computational bandwidth. The offshore server network sustaining this deepfake ecosystem costs hundreds of thousands of dollars every month. I highlighted the operational burn rate, forcing the audience to look at the staggering numbers. The venture capital funding this startup was depleted over 6 months ago, I stated, the arithmetic slicing through the murmurs in the room. The official accounts are empty, yet the ghost servers are fully operational. I initiated a reverse trace on the untraceable offshore payments to unmask the origin of the capital. The screens displayed the path of the wire transfers, tracking the money from the Nevada shell company backward through the Delaware clearinghouse. I looked down from the podium and locked eyes with my father. Charles sat 3 rows behind his shattered son. He was gripping the top of the wooden pew in front of him. His knuckles were stark white, the blood entirely drained from his hands. He knew exactly what was about to populate on the massive screens above my head. The realization of his impending federal indictment settled over his shoulders, physically pressing him downward into his seat. The money funding this fraud does not belong to a shadow investor, I continued. I tapped the screen one final time. The origin routing numbers appeared, stripped of their protective metadata, alongside the official PDF banking document I had extracted the night before. The capital originates directly from Charles Barnes Wealth Management, I declared. My voice carried no malice, only the sterile chill of the truth. Specifically, the funds were siphoned from a pooled pension trust belonging to retired municipal workers and public school teachers across this state. The auction hall went absolutely still. Intellectual theft in the technology sector is a scandal. Embezzling the life savings of working-class Texans is a cardinal sin. The collective gaze of the room shifted from the screens to my father. The men and women sitting around him physically recoiled, the social contagion of his crime repelling them. Charles could not endure the silence. The patriarch, a man who had spent 3 decades commanding rooms with unyielding authority, panicked. He scrambled to his feet, his tailored navy suit failing to project dominance. "You are lying," Charles shouted, his baritone cracking into a desperate roar. He pointed a trembling finger at the podium. "This is a fabrication. You are a vindictive, disturbed child attempting to extort your own blood." I remained perfectly still, letting his hysteria wash over the microphone. The evidence on the screens was immutable. It possessed timestamps, routing sequences, and official banking watermarks. "If you proceed with this delusion," Charles threatened, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, "I will erase you. I will cut you out of the trust. You are destroying your own inheritance. You will walk out of this room with absolutely nothing." He was clinging to the last shred of leverage he possessed, desperately trying to deploy the same ultimatum he had attempted in the parking garage. He assumed the audience of billionaires and tycoons would respect the threat of disinheritance. He assumed wealth was the only currency that mattered in this hall. I leaned closer to the microphone. The acoustics of the cathedral-like room caught my words, amplifying them with crystal clarity. "I have no need for your inheritance, Father," I replied. The quiet confidence of the statement stalled his momentum. Charles blinked, confusion piercing through his rage. I pressed a final command on my tablet. The screens shifted again. The massive displays split, showing the outbound embezzlement transfers on the left and a secondary, heavily encrypted ledger on the right. "Because I am the one who has been quietly paying off the debts of your corruption for the past 3 years, I stated. The room stared at the new ledger. It displayed a meticulous, chronological record of automated wire transfers, funneling massive sums of untraceable capital back into the exact pension portfolios Charles had raided. "Every time you siphoned capital to pay my brother offshore hosting invoices," I explained, dismantling his patriarchal delusion in front of the state's most powerful brokers. My automated ghost routing script triggered a corresponding deposit. I utilized my own covert cybersecurity consulting bounties to backfill your theft in real time. I silently replaced the stolen money, dollar for dollar, ensuring your innocent clients never lost a fraction of a cent. Charles' jaw dropped. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist suddenly looked like cheap costume jewelry. He stared at the screens, the reality of the mathematical alignment crashing over him. "You treated me like a defective component," I continued, my voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You erased me to elevate a golden child who built a fake empire out of my stolen labor. But you survived entirely on my unreported charity. I subsidized your fraud. I protected the innocent people you were willing to destroy." The silence that followed was total. It was the sound of a generational legacy being vaporized. The golden child sat ruined by the algorithm he stole. The patriarch stood dismantled by the invisible daughter he erased. The manufactured narrative they had spent 3 decades curating was permanently shattered. From the elevated private gallery, Wyatt Kensington stood up. He did not applaud. He did not offer a dramatic speech. He operated with the ruthless efficiency of a man who eliminates toxic liabilities. "The letter of intent is void," Wyatt announced, his voice slicing through the heavy atmosphere of the hall. "The acquisition offer is formally rescinded due to material misrepresentation and criminal fraud." He turned his head slightly, addressing the lead corporate counsel standing beside him. "Contact federal regulators immediately. We are legally obligated to file a report with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the fraudulent disclosures presented during our preliminary review." The lawyer nodded once, pulling his phone from his pocket. The action was swift and merciless. Down in the front row, Preston buried his face in his trembling hands. The bespoke suit crumpled around his shoulders. He was about to face federal indictment for wire fraud and investor deception. Charles stood frozen in the aisle, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a sympathetic face among his peers. He found none. The men who had shaken his hand and shared his expensive bourbon now looked at him with pure disgust. The realization of federal prison, the loss of his license, and the total destruction of the Barnes name finally broke his posture. He slumped forward, the authoritarian king stripped of his kingdom. Wyatt tapped the glass railing of the gallery, signaling the auction house security personnel. "Escort these men off the premises," Wyatt ordered. 4 towering security guards, dressed in dark suits, moved down the central aisle with professional urgency. They approached my father and brother. Preston did not resist. He stumbled out of his chair, his spirit entirely broken, and allowed the guards to guide him toward the exit. Charles resisted for a fraction of a second. He pulled his arm away from the guard grip, straightening his jacket in a desperate, pathetic attempt to retain a shred of dignity. He looked back at Wyatt, then looked down the long aisle at me. He was staring at the architect who had drafted his ruin, the silent savior he had chosen to discard. He turned and walked out the heavy oak doors, flanked by security. I watched them leave. I did not feel a rush of triumphant adrenaline. I did not feel the chaotic, emotional burn of revenge. What I felt was clean. What I felt was the cold, structural peace of a balanced ledger. The math had finally corrected itself. The liabilities had been purged. I reached down and unplugged the connection cable from my encrypted tablet. The massive digital screens above me blinked twice, then faded to a neutral black. I tucked the drive securely under my arm and stepped away from the podium. The auctioneer, recovering his composure, tapped his gavel lightly against the sounding block. But the dynamic had shifted permanently. As I walked back up the central aisle toward the exit, the elite brokers and tycoons parted, offering me a wide, respectful berth. They did not see a dropout. They did not see a family failure. They saw a sovereign entity who possessed the intellect to build empires and the discipline to burn them down. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, leaving the auction hall behind. But the controlled demolition of the Barnes family was far from over. When a hollow structure loses its primary support, the collapse generates a tremendous amount of noise, drawing spectators from miles around to watch the dust settle. And the primary enabler of the fraud was about to deploy her final, desperate tactic. The weeks following the Texas Heritage Land Auction unfolded with the predictable, unyielding velocity of a controlled demolition. When a hollow structure loses its primary support pillar, the ensuing collapse generates a tremendous amount of noise, drawing spectators from every corner of the state to watch the dust settle. I monitored the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my Austin apartment, tracking the variables as they shifted from private consequence to public spectacle. The business sections of the regional newspapers caught the scent of the disaster within 48 hours. The headlines progressed in a steady, damning cadence. First came the announcement that Kensington Telecom formally rescinded its letter of intent, citing due diligence irregularities. 3 days later, the narrative escalated from irregularities to federal criminality. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally announced a joint investigation with the Department of Justice into the synthetic user acquisition metrics and capital expenditures of my brother agricultural startup. The venture capitalists who had funded Preston's initial seed round reacted with the panicked speed of rats fleeing a submerged hoe. They filed civil suits to recoup their investments, simultaneously issuing press releases to distance themselves from the disgraced founder. Without the influx of Wyatt Kensington capital, the agricultural technology firm declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The Nevada Shell Company ceased operations. The ghost servers went dark. The synthetic traffic stopped flowing. The empty shell of the company crumpled under the weight of its own operational debt. Preston was indicted on federal charges of wire fraud and investor deception. The media published a photograph of him leaving the federal courthouse in Dallas. He looked haggard. He was required to surrender his passport and post a staggering bond to avoid pretrial detention. The systemic rot I had exposed ensured the destruction did not stop at my brother's doorstep. The financial contagion spread upward, infecting the very foundation of the family legacy. When the offshore payments ceased, the true purpose of my father's secret loans became undeniable. The regional commercial bank that held his variable rate mortgages initiated an aggressive audit of his assets. Federal regulators moved in and seized Charles Barnes' wealth management. The performative wealth that had defined my parents' existence evaporated overnight. Their country club memberships were revoked. Their luxury vehicles were repossessed. The sprawling Dallas estate, staged so perfectly for elite dinner parties and societal climbing, was placed on the market at a significant loss to cover the exorbitant retainer fees of their criminal defense attorneys. They mortgaged their reality to protect a lie, and the lie had consumed them entirely. I sat at my desk, sipping black coffee from a ceramic mug, organizing the digital documentation of the legal outcomes. The contrast between my current state and the chaos consuming my family was stark. The people who had obsessed over appearances, who had sacrificed my dignity for a photo op, were now splashed across the front pages in utter disgrace. Meanwhile, the invisible daughter remained pristine, untouched by the scandal, observing the collapse from a safe, analytical distance. The ceramic mug felt warm against my palms. The The bitter taste of the dark roast grounded my senses. My 3 curved monitors emitted a soft blue glow, the processing fans humming a steady, familiar rhythm. I watched the pristine consequences of math correct a 30-year lie. My phone vibrated against the matte finish of the desk. The sudden mechanical buzz disrupted the quiet sanctuary of the room. I glanced at the screen. The caller identification displayed my mother name, Eleanor Barnes. I had blocked incoming calls from Charles and Preston the moment I walked out of the auction hall. I left Eleanor number unblocked, not out of lingering affection, but out of a clinical curiosity regarding how long it would take the primary enabler to pivot her strategy. It took exactly 21 days. I did not answer the call. I watched the phone vibrate across the desk until the screen went dark, routing the connection to voicemail. A minute later, a notification icon appeared. I tapped the screen and engaged the speakerphone. The audio quality was sharp, capturing a ragged, exhausted intake of breath before my mother spoke. "Vicky, please do not delete this," Eleanor began. Her voice was entirely stripped of the melodic, practiced pitch she used for polite society. It sounded thin, scraped raw by weeks of relentless stress and public humiliation. Eleanor was a woman who had never held a formal occupation. Her entire life was dedicated to curation. She curated the family image, the holiday cards, the seating arrangements. She was the architect of the social facade, complicit in the financial fraud because she demanded the luxurious lifestyle it afforded. When I was a teenager, she used to hide my computer equipment in the closet before guests arrived. Ashamed of a daughter who preferred soldering motherboards over attending debutante cotillions. "I know you are angry," Eleanor continued, a wet sob interrupting her words. "I know we made mistakes. We were blind. We were foolish to put so much pressure on your brother. Your father is a broken man. He has barely left his study in 3 weeks. We are losing the house, Vicky. The bank is taking everything." I listened to the litany of consequences, my expression remaining neutral. She was detailing the exact mathematical outcome I had predicted. "I am so sorry," Eleanor cried, her voice cracking into a frantic, desperate pitch. "I am sorry we did not see your potential. I am sorry we let him take credit for your hard work. You are brilliant. You always were. We were just too stupid to understand it." The apology hung in the quiet air of my apartment. Decades ago, I would have traded everything I owned to hear those specific words. I had spent my youth craving validation. I had wanted the people who brought me into the world to look at me and recognize my inherent worth. But hearing the apology now, filtered through the static of a voicemail, it carried zero emotional weight. It was hollow. It was a calculated transaction. "Please, Vicky," Eleanor begged, the true purpose of the call finally surfacing from beneath the tears. "Preston is facing real prison time. The federal prosecutors will not offer a plea deal, but Wyatt Kensington holds all the leverage. If he drops his cooperation, if he withdraws the formal complaint, the Securities and Exchange Commission might reduce the charges." The sob turned into a ragged gasp. "You saved Wyatt Company years ago. He respects you. He listens to you. You are the only one who can talk to him. Please, call Wyatt. Ask him to show mercy. We are begging you. You are our only hope. Save your brother. Vicky, please." The recording ended. The mechanical voice of the automated system offered the options to save or delete the message. I sat in my ergonomic chair, evaluating the strategic architecture of her plea. The enabler had finally acknowledged my competence, not because she valued my intellect, but because she needed to weaponize it to protect the golden child one last time. She was asking me to compromise my own integrity. She wanted me to burn the professional capital I had earned with a telecommunications billionaire to shield a criminal from the consequences of his own actions. They only loved my power when they needed to extract it to save the parasite. They wanted me to build a bridge over the chasm they had dug themselves. The forensic detachment that had protected me my entire life solidified into a permanent barrier. I did not feel a pang of guilt. I did not feel the urge to rescue them. The emotional umbilical cord, frayed and degraded over 30 years of neglect, finally severed cleanly. I owed them nothing. The ledger was balanced. I reached out and tapped the screen of my phone. The red icon flashed. The audio file vanished from the server, erased from existence with cold, undeniable finality. I picked up my coffee mug and turned my attention back to the primary monitor, ready to close the agricultural startup archive folder for good. My family had engineered their own ruin, and I was officially resigning from the role of their silent savior. Before my hand touched the mouse, the phone vibrated again. I looked at the screen. It was not an automated notification. It was a direct incoming call. The caller identification displayed a private number, but the routing prefix was highly specific. It belonged to the Executive Exchange of Kensington Telecom. I set my mug down on the desk. I let the phone ring 3 times, allowing the rhythm to establish a professional cadence before I accepted the connection and brought the receiver to my ear. Wyatt Kensington did not call to offer condolences. Men who build telecommunications empires do not trade in sentimentality. When he spoke, his voice carried the unhurried, measured cadence of a chief executive who had already calculated the variables and determined the outcome. "I trust the public fallout has not disturbed your routine," Wyatt said, a subtle undercurrent of respect threading through his words. "I prefer to observe chaotic systems from a distance," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly aligned with his professional calm. "The data tends to be much cleaner." He let out a short, genuine laugh. It was a sound rarely heard in the upper echelons of his corporate structure, a sound entirely absent from the tense rehearsal dinner where we first met. "I appreciate clarity. Vicky, it is a rare commodity in this state," Wyatt continued, "which is exactly why I am calling. I am having lunch at the Houston Executive Club at noon today. I have reserved a private dining room. I would like you to join me. We have a final piece of business to conclude regarding the shadow audit. The invitation was not a request. It was a directive wrapped in polite corporate protocol. I will be there," I said. The Houston Executive Club operates entirely on the currency of absolute silence and discretion. There are no flashing cameras, no forced networking events, and no opulent displays of manufactured wealth. The architecture is steeped in understated permanence, featuring heavy mahogany doors, muted ambient lighting, and deeply upholstered leather booths. It is a sanctuary built specifically for the people who actually own the boardrooms, a place insulated from the desperate scrambling of founders trying to fake their way to evaluation. I handed the keys of my modest sedan to the valet and walked through the discreet front entrance. The concierge did not ask for my name or a reservation number. He simply offered a polite nod, recognizing me instantly, and guided me down a private corridor lined with sound-absorbing panels. We arrived at a secluded dining room overlooking the sprawling expanse of the Houston skyline. The table was set for 2. Wyatt was already seated, reading a printed brief while taking a sip of mineral water. He wore a dark, unstructured suit jacket, projecting an air of relaxed, unassailable authority. He set the brief aside as I entered. He stood up, offering a respectful nod, and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Thank you for making the drive, Vicky," Wyatt said. I took my seat, placing my leather clutch on the adjacent chair. The view from the window was spectacular, framing the technological and financial heart of Texas in a sweeping panoramic vista. "It is an impressive venue," I replied, keeping my tone measured. A waiter appeared silently from a side door. He poured sparkling water into our crystal glasses, set down the menus, and vanished just as quickly. The interaction emphasized the absolute parity and respect in the room. It was a stark, intentional contrast to the rehearsal dinner, where I had been relegated to the back corner, positioned near the kitchen doors as a prop for my brother's punchline. We did not engage in trivial small talk. We ordered our meals and Wyatt immediately shifted the focus to the architecture of the fallout. He informed me that his daughter was navigating the dissolution of her brief engagement with the clinical precision he had taught her. She had excised the toxic liability from her life before it could compromise her own foundation. "You performed a surgical extraction," Wyatt stated, cutting his steak with methodical precision. "You navigated a highly volatile emotional minefield without allowing the sentiment to corrupt your data. That requires a specific type of discipline, a discipline I rarely encounter, even at the highest levels of my own organization." I took a sip of my water. "I simply followed the packet routing," I said. "The numbers provided the map. I just read the topography." Wyatt set his knife down. He picked up a sleek black leather portfolio resting beside his plate and slid it across the polished table. It stopped precisely in front of my glass. "I need someone who can read the topography on a permanent basis," he said. I looked at the folder, then up at the billionaire. The chief information officer of my primary logistics and rural broadband conglomerate recently announced his retirement. Wyatt explained, his voice taking on the sharp, decisive cadence of a chief executive closing a major acquisition. "The board is currently evaluating external candidates. I am halting that search. I want you to take the position." The offer hung in the quiet air of the private dining room. I stared at the closed leather portfolio. Inside that folder was the ultimate societal validation. It was a C-suite executive title. It came with an equity stake, a corner office overlooking the Houston skyline, and a guaranteed salary that would eclipse my previous decade of earnings in a single fiscal year. The profound, inescapable irony of the moment washed over me. Charles Barnes had mortgaged the retirement portfolios of his innocent clients, bankrupting himself and my mother, all to buy his golden son a brief, fraudulent audience with Wyatt Kensington. Preston had stolen my intellectual property and committed federal wire fraud just to secure a fraction of the billionaire approval. My family had destroyed themselves trying to pick the lock on the front door of the empire. And now the emperor was sliding the keys across the table to the invisible daughter. I did not reach for the folder. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I listened to the low hum of the climate control system, mapping the trajectory of the life Wyatt was offering me. It was a golden ticket. It was everything my parents had worshipped. But I looked at the gold, and I recognized the shape of the cage. "I appreciate the magnitude of this offer, Wyatt," I said. My voice was steady, rooted in a deep, unshakable certainty. "I understand exactly what this portfolio represents." "Then open it," he suggested, a hint of genuine anticipation in his eyes. I shook my head slowly. "I cannot accept the position." Wyatt blinked, the anticipation freezing into genuine surprise. In his world, people did not decline a seat at his table. They spent their entire careers bleeding for the opportunity to pull out a chair. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "May I ask why?" he inquired. His tone was devoid of offense, carrying only an analytical curiosity. "Are the compensation metrics insufficient? We can adjust the equity distribution." "It has nothing to do with the compensation," I replied, maintaining unwavering eye contact. "It is about the architecture of the role. If I accept the title of Chief Information Officer, I become a component of your corporate hierarchy. I have to manage internal politics. I have to navigate board members, sit in executive meetings, and defend my budgets against competing divisions. I have to wear the uniform of the entity." I paused, letting my gaze drift momentarily to the sprawling skyline below before bringing it back to the billionaire. "I spent my entire life inside a rotten family cage," I explained, laying my philosophy bare. "I was assigned a role I did not choose, governed by rules designed to extract my value while erasing my presence. I promised myself I would never be owned by another system again. I will not trade a familial cage for a luxurious corporate cage, no matter how lucrative the constraints might be." Wyatt listened intently, absorbing the underlying logic of my refusal. "I am a forensic systems auditor," I continued. I find the broken nodes. I isolate the rot. I fix the structural failures. But I can only do that effectively if I remain outside the blast radius. I prefer the autonomy of the shadows. I prefer to be the mechanic, not the machine. Silence descended upon the private dining room. Wyatt stared at me for a long, calculating minute. He looked at the closed leather folder, then back at my face. The surprise in his eyes slowly transformed into a deep, profound respect. He reached across the table and pulled the portfolio back toward his side of the table. "You are a sovereign entity," Vicky Wyatt said, a rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I can respect that boundary, but I still require your specific diagnostic capabilities. My network is expanding rapidly, and I need a mechanic who operates entirely outside the political blast radius." He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a silver pen, and flipped the leather folder open. He crossed out the primary employment contract with a single, dark line. He turned to the final page of the document and drafted a series of numbers in the margin. He slid the folder back across the table. "An independent consulting retainer," Wyatt proposed. "You retain your total autonomy, you accept no corporate title, you report exclusively to me, and only when a critical structural vulnerability requires an uncompromised audit. You set your own hours, you dictate your own methods." I looked at the number he had written in the margin. The retainer fee was exorbitant. It was a figure that secured absolute financial independence for the rest of my life. It was not a salary. It was a sovereign grant. I picked up the silver pen resting on the table. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. We finished our lunch discussing logistical theory and the evolving nature of encrypted supply chains. It was a conversation between equals, devoid of performative arrogance or hidden agendas. When the meal concluded, Wyatt stood, offered a firm professional handshake, and departed to manage his empire. I drove back to Austin as the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the Texas sky in vibrant shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. The traffic flowed smoothly along the interstate, a functional system operating without friction. I unlocked the door to my minimalist apartment. The space was quiet, clean, and perfectly aligned. I walked past the kitchen and entered my home office. The 3 curved monitors sat dark, waiting for an input command. I stood by the window, looking out over the city. My mind drifted back to the rehearsal dinner. I remembered the heavy scent of expensive bourbon, the clink of crystal, and the suffocating grip of the social hierarchy. I remembered Preston pointing his glass at me, introducing me as the Dropout. He had intended it as an execution. He had intended to cement my status as the invisible disappointment, the defective component in their curated machine. But he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of engineering. He did not realize that when a system is inherently corrupt, failing to conform to its parameters is not a defect. It is a triumph. Charles, Eleanor, and Preston had built a towering house out of fabricated metrics, stolen intellect, and leveraged debt. They believed they could defy the basic laws of physics as long as the paint looked expensive. But gravity is a relentless auditor. It does not care about your social connections. It does not care about your charming smile or your tailored suits. Gravity always pulls down a house built on lies. I turned away from the window and walked over to my desk. I pressed the power button on the primary tower. The fans spun to life with a quiet, reassuring hum. The monitors flared blue, casting their familiar, comforting glow across the dark room. I picked up my mug, took a sip of hot black coffee, and pulled the ergonomic keyboard toward my chest. A new, highly complex data set was waiting in my encrypted inbox, sent directly from Wyatt Kensington private server. I cracked my knuckles, aligning my fingers over the keys. Peace is not something you inherit. It is not something you are given by the people who demand your silence. Peace is a structure you build yourself, one honest line of code at a time. Peace is earned. I initiated the sequence, and I began to work.